It's not every day a new product is made that changes the world. But every once in a while, something is designed so amazingly, so delicately, so different that it changes everything. From the makers of Power Injection, we present to you the 100% original, definitely not stolen from any other popular pixel controller brand, the one and only Differential receivers. Are you sick and tired of having long wire runs to your pixels that are far away? Just wish you could put a smaller controller at the location of all of your pixels, but also don't want to spend $200+ on one when you barely use it to its full potential? Then you need differential receivers. Differential receivers allow you to take one Ethernet cable and connect it to a pixel controller that supports differential receivers and run it right to the differential receivers. And then you can put these in a central location and connect all of your pixels in that area directly to the 4 onboard pixel ports. So what are you waiting for? Call now to receive your receivers and make setting up pixels all over your display as easy as untangling last year's Christmas lights. Trust me, it's not that hard. It's easy. It's easier than yeah. Hey everyone, thanks for watching How to Pixel. And yes, today we are talking about a really big topic, and that is smart differential receivers. These little guys are really powerful and make it a lot easier to control pixels that are all over your display, whether they're close or far from your controller. Now, a few things quickly before I get into talking about all of the information about these and how they work. Technology is always changing every single day. No matter whether it's technology for cars or things for making your home smarter or for devices that run a light show, no matter what, the technology is always changing every day. So if you're watching this video way after it's released, some of the things I show may not be set up the same, they may not work the same. I'm always trying to keep these light show tutorials updated with the present technology, so if you are watching this a long time after the video is released, I recommend checking out the description or comment section to see if I've posted a link to an updated video. That way you don't spend all of your time watching this video and then realize all of the information is inaccurate and irrelevant now. And then finally, like always, if there's a certain part of the video you want to see or skip to, please feel free to use the timestamps in the scrub bar and in the description below so you don't have to watch parts that are going to waste your time if you don't need to learn about them, and you can get right into seeing what you want to watch. But I'm going to talk about how this video is going to be formatted. Due to the amount of information that's involved with these little things, I'm going to split this video up into 2 parts. That way it doesn't look like one long, scary hour-long video. In this first part, I'm going to talk about the complete basics of receivers, what their purpose is, and give an overview to how they work. And then I'll also talk about the different types of these, because there are a lot, and the different types of controllers that work with them. And then I'm also going to talk about this little mode switch dial that all receivers have, because it is a little bit confusing, but I'll talk about that later. Then in the next part, I'll talk about pixel port sharing and how that works, what it is when you have lots of receivers on certain controllers. And I'll also talk about how you set these up in your controller's web interface and in X-Lights. So don't be scared. It does look like a lot of information, but I'm going to try and take it nice and slow so everything will make sense. If at any point throughout this video you're confused about something or have a question, you can feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below or wait till the end of the video in case I answer it. But if you do have any comments, please feel free to leave them down below and I'll try to help you out. But now let's get into the basics of differential receivers and what their purpose is. The original differential receivers were designed by Pixel Controller, or better known as Falcon controllers. They were meant to be used with a differential expansion board that you could attach to an F16 V2 controller. It's a pretty old controller that you rarely hear about these days because it is very outdated now. This expansion board allowed you to connect an Ethernet cable to any one of these RJ45 jacks and then run it to one of these differential receivers. You could then place these differential receivers up to 250 feet away from the controller and have all of your pixels connect directly into the receiver. That way you don't need to have 250 feet of cable, or however long the distance between your pixels and controller is. You don't need to have all those data wires and power wires running between your controller and pixels. Instead, you could run one Ethernet cable and then one power cord with this differential receiver here that all of the pixels could plug into. Well, fast forward many years later, with new designs and devices these work with, the differential receivers still have the main purpose of making it easier to connect pixels that are far away from your controller, or even close if you wanted, but now there are a lot more features involved with it. One feature the receivers have nowadays is you can now chain these receivers off of one Ethernet connection. So you don't even need to have multiple Ethernet cables running to each receiver. You can chain them off of one Ethernet cable. Also, these receivers now work with lots of different controllers, not just Falcon controllers. Currently, at the time of making this, there are 10 different types of differential receivers. I only have 4 of the different types, but I will be explaining all of the other types too in this video. And these are all of the receivers right here on the screen the Falcon controllers currently have. Some of them are older, some of them are newer, some of them have different designs, but they all have the one thing in common, that they can be placed far away from your controller and run pixels directly from it. The receivers do also need power, so what most people will do is put a power supply at the location of the receiver, but then once you have that, you can get anywhere from 4 to 24 extra ports in that area depending on some different factors. So that is the main basics and purpose for differential receivers. But now I'm going to talk about the different Falcon controllers that support them and which ones are used for which scenarios. So there are currently 7 relevant controllers that work with differential receivers. The reason I say relevant is because there are some other ones, but they are really old and outdated, and most people don't use them nowadays, so I'm not really going to be talking about those. But first, we have 3 controllers from the V3 series. We have the F16 V3, the F48 V3 or F48 Original, and the F4 V3. All of these support differential receivers, but I'm actually also not going to talk about these ones because I already have an older video about differential receivers, and the way differential receivers work is a little bit different with those controllers. So I recommend, if you're planning on using one of those controllers, checking out this video here and the older tutorial about differential receivers. In fact, sadly, the entire V3 series has been discontinued. You can no longer buy them, but that's because Falcon is coming out with the newer V4 and V5 controllers, and those controllers are what I'm going to be talking about in this video that work with differential receivers. Next, we have the F16 V4 and the F48 V4, which also support differential receivers. The F16 V4 is mainly meant to be used in an area where you have pixels close by that you can connect directly to the onboard pixel ports. However, you can still chain 2 receiver chains on these 2 outputs right here, and you can also get 1 or 2 differential expansion boards that allow you to have 4 or 8 extra RJ45 jacks that you can add more receiver chains to. The F48 V4 and all other F48 type controllers are mainly meant to run just differential receivers. You can tell by the 12 RJ45 jacks that are on the board that allow you to have a chain of receivers on each. There's also 4 onboard pixel ports, but it's basically just a differential receiver built into the board, and that way if you do have a few close by pixels, you can connect them directly to the controller. And then finally we have the F16 V5 and the F48 V5. These are brand new controllers from Falcon controllers. They support all differential receivers, and they take full advantage of the new V5 receivers that have lots of features on them. Now, I actually happen to have the F16 V5, and it's a little different from the other F16s. You have the 16 onboard pixel ports for connecting any pixels that are close by to the board, but then you also have 4 RJ45 jacks at the top that can each have their own differential receiver chain. So what this controller did was basically take a normal F16 and then take a differential expansion board and build it right into the board. So that way you can run both close by pixels and differential receiver chains. The F48 V5 is just like the F48 V4. It has the 12 RJ45 jacks on it for receiver chains and also 4 built-in pixel ports. However, there are a lot more features with the F48 V5. And also, it can take full advantage of the new V5 receivers, whereas the F48 V4 only works with them normally and doesn't work with the new features on here that I'll talk about later. Now, there are lots of other controllers out there besides Falcon controllers, such as Cupboards or Wally's Lights Pixel controllers, and all of those support Falcon receivers too. However, I'm not familiar with any of those other controllers, so you'll have to do some research if you have any of them to see if they support Falcon receivers. Everything you learn in this video about differential receivers will still apply no matter which controller you have. So now we know the basics on how receivers work, we know which controllers support them, but now let's take a look into the different types of differential receivers and which situations those can be used for. So first, we have the original V1 receivers, and there are two types of them. There is the dumb V1 receiver, and then there's the smart V1 receiver. I happen to have the smart V1 receiver, I don't have the dumb one. Falcon Controllers actually calls this receiver a normal receiver, but everyone likes to call it a dumb receiver just because it's a funnier name, and it kind of is dumb. The reason it's dumb is because there's only one RJ45 jack on it, meaning you cannot chain those receivers. Once you put one into one connection on a controller, there's no more. You can't chain anymore. Whereas the smart ones, they have two RJ45 jacks, and that allows you to have the signal come into one RJ45 jack and then out of the other into the next receiver. Now, the only problem with these V1 receivers is they don't really work nowadays with the new controllers coming out. They still work fine with the V3 series controllers, but with the V4 and V5 series, you're really limited to what you can do with them. Now, if you happen to have one of these, which you can no longer buy, but if you have one of these and you have a V3 series controller and you'd like to figure out how to make them work, I recommend checking out that video I linked just a few minutes ago, because it's, like I said, different than the receivers nowadays. So since these are really old and can't do much with V4 or V5 controllers, I'm not going to be talking about the V1 receivers in this video. Now, every other receiver I'm going to talk about in this video, it works perfectly fine with the V4 and V5 controllers. The next receiver is the V2 receiver. This is a receiver that came out with the V4 series controllers, and it was actually the first time we saw a big change to the differential receivers. This receiver has no dumb version, it's only smart, so you can chain these together because there are two RJ45 jacks. You can also mix and match these with other receiver versions and types in a chain, and they do even work with the V3 controllers. Then we have the V4 receiver. I'm pretty sure Falcon controllers skipped the V3 receiver and never made one, because I never heard anything about it and I can't find any information about it. If there is a V3 receiver, I am terribly sorry, I could not find out any information about them. But next is the V4 receiver, and this is when the smart receivers actually started getting smart. Like, one new feature, for example, is all V4 receivers now have something called auto detect protocol. So with most protocols, there's this little dial down here that you have to change to a whole bunch of different settings depending on which protocol you're using and the ID of the receiver. We'll get into all of that later, so don't worry about it. But this can auto detect most protocols, which makes setting this a little bit easier. Now, the V4 types of receivers are still fairly new, and you can still buy these right now. And yeah. I also forgot to add, I'm pretty sure they fixed a lot of bugs that certain receivers were having with the V4 receiver, so it's less buggy. And then we have the latest receiver, the V5 differential receiver. This is just like all the other receivers, except it's not, because there are a ton of new features on this one. For just a few examples, there are no longer automotive fuses on here. There are E fuses, which can be reset automatically when you power off and power back on the board or from a controller. The pixel ports can count how many pixels are on that port. What else? Oh, it can detect the voltage coming in, it can detect the temperature, it can detect the amperage, and it can report it all back to a controller if you have a V5 controller. Lots of features, and I'll get into all of them later when I talk specifically about this. Now, these receivers I just showed you, excluding the V1 ones, all of these are considered SRX1 receivers. The SR stands for Smart Receiver, and the X1 stands for times 1. So, Smart Receiver times 1. Now, recently, Falcon controllers have been coming out with bigger receivers that have a lot more ports on them, like these on the screen, for example. This specific receiver has 8 ports on it, and this receiver is considered an SRX2 receiver. The reason why is that stands for Smart Receiver times 2. That's because since there are 8 ports on the board, it's like having 2 receivers packed into one board, because a regular receiver and the classic ones all have 4 ports on them. So with these new receivers that have 8 ports on them, it's basically 2 smart receivers packed into one board. So if I'm ever talking about the maximum amount of receivers you can have on a chain, if I say you can only have 6 receivers on a chain, this receiver counts as 2 receivers, meaning you can only have 3 of these on a chain because each count is 2. And then there's also this giant receiver. This receiver has 16 ports on it, and it's considered an SRX4 receiver. So Smart Remote times 4. That's because it's basically 4 receivers crammed into one board, and that way you can make it a lot easier instead of having to buy 4 separate receivers if you need that many ports in an area. So just remember, this receiver counts as 4 receivers when you're doing your setup and stuff. Now these 2 receivers are most similar to the V4 type of receivers because they have the auto detect protocol, they have all of the bugs worked out. They just haven't added the features yet that the V5 receivers have, but they do plan on making those types of receivers with all the V5 features sometime down the road, if I'm not mistaken. And then there are 3 final receivers I need to talk about, and they look like this. And you'll notice all of these ones have something in common too. All of these receivers can plug directly into a mean well power supply or any other type of power supply where these little things sticking out on the board will fit into. That way you don't have to run power wires to the board, just attach it directly into a power supply. This first one is the SRX1 power supply receiver. It acts just like a SRX1 V4 receiver, except it plugs into a power supply. It has auto detect protocol, it just doesn't have all the V5 features yet. Now for this one, I'm going to throw a new term at you, don't worry, I'll explain it. This is the NRX1 receiver. I know, it's super complicated with all these different receiver types, but this one stands for normal receiver times 1. That's because if you look at it, there's only one RJ45 jack on it, meaning that it's basically a dumb receiver. You can't chain them. So that's why they call it the NRX1. If I had it my way, I'd call it the DRX1 because it's a dumb receiver, but that's what Falcon Controllers calls it. The reason they didn't put another RJ45 jack on there is so they could fit room for power injection ports that you can see right here, so you can hook power injection wires to this receiver. And then the final receiver we have is the SRX2 power supply receiver. This receiver has 8 ports on it, so it counts as 2 receivers, hence the SRX2, but this one is basically like a V5 receiver because it has E-fuses on it and auto detect protocol, all those fancy things I talked about earlier on. So that's all the receivers Falcon has currently. Now all of them, you can mix and match them on a chain. You don't need to have just one single type. You could have an SRX2 and then an SRX1 V5 and then an SRX1 V2, as long as you aren't using the V1 receivers because they don't work with the new protocol. If you absolutely must use a V1 receiver with a V5 or a V4 controller, the way it works is you can only attach one single receiver. If it's a dumb one or a smart one, you can't chain them. It'll just automatically act as a dumb receiver. So you can use that if you absolutely have to, if you have any leftover receivers from the V3 series and that's why you have it. But I recommend getting the newer receivers because they're a lot cooler. And now these receivers are also reverse compatible, so you can use these on a V3 series controller. However, on the V3 series controllers, you're limited to chaining up to 3 receivers. So you can have a V1 receiver, then a V5, and then a V2, and that's it. You can't chain any more than 3. Now you might be thinking, what if I want to use the SRX4 receiver on the F16 V3 or the original F48 or something like that? Well, what would happen is since this receiver is basically 4 receivers, the final block of ports won't work because the first 3 will be consuming the only 3 receivers that can be chained. But now if you're using any of these receivers on any V4 or V5 controller, you can chain up to 6 receivers per chain. So here's a few examples of some of the different setups you could have. And we need to make sure to remember that the SRX4 receivers count as 4 receivers right there, and the SRX2 receivers count as 2 receivers. Hopefully you're still with me by now, because now we're going to be talking about the components and the individual pieces on the receiver so you can know which each one does. And I'll also be talking about the specs such as the voltage it takes and amperage and all that good stuff. So obviously it would be hard to explain each individual receiver in this video since there are like 10 different receivers. So what I'm going to do is talk about the V4 receiver and the V5 receiver, since a lot of receivers are similar to these two. So all the V2, V4, and the SRX2 and SRX4 receivers will be most similar to the V4 receiver. And then the V5 receiver, obviously, there's only one other receiver, which is the SRX2 power supply receiver. That one is most similar to the V5 receiver. So first, I'll talk about this one. If you have any of these receivers on the screen, this part will be most helpful for you. And then I'm going to talk about the V5 receiver, and if you have this or the other V5 receiver, then that part will be most similar for you. So first, at the very top of the board, there are 4 pixel outputs. You may have 8 or 16 depending on which receiver type you have. All receivers can only drive 3-wire pixels. Any pixels with a clock wire will not work. If you do happen to have pixels that have the 4th wire and you need to run those, you'll have to run them directly off of a controller. The ports are labeled 1 to 4, and ground or negative is on the left, data is in the middle, and voltage or positive is on the right. The receivers always come with these Euro connectors, and they plug into the ports on the receiver. You can unscrew it to put your wire in it, and then tighten it up so the wire does not fall out. Each of the 4 ports are fused with a 5-amp replaceable automotive fuse. The fuses all have indicator lights, and if one is off, that means that fuse is blown. Underneath the pixel ports, there are 4 data LEDs. These will light up if the receiver is connected to a controller and is properly communicating with it. Over on the left side of the receiver, there's a test button that will test just the pixels on this receiver, even if the receiver is not connected to a controller. This is great for debugging, so you can figure out if your pixels aren't working because of a configuration error or just because they aren't wired correctly. Depending on if you have a V2 or V4 type receiver, you may either have to hold the button or press it once to begin the test. You can continue pressing it to go through the different test patterns. When you're in test mode, the data LEDs will light up to signify which test pattern you're on. As you go through the patterns, the LEDs will change. To turn off the test mode, just hold the test button until the data LEDs flash or the pixels turn off. Certain receivers have different test patterns, and if you have an older one, there may be fewer test patterns than the newer receivers have. Next, on the bottom right of the board is the power input terminal. This is what powers the board and all of the pixel ports. You can use any voltage between 5 and 13 DC volts, and there are no switches that need to be changed before applying power. If you power the board with 5 volts, you should only use 5 volt pixels on the ports. If you power the board with 12 volts, you should only use 12 volt pixels on the ports. The connectors on the V2 and V4 SRX1 receivers are rated for a max of 20 amps. On the SRX2 receiver, the input connector is rated for a max of 30 amps since there are more ports. On the SRX4 receiver, there are 2 power inputs. Each are also rated for a max of 30 amps. On this receiver, the power terminal on the left side of the board powers pixel ports 1 through 8, and the power terminal on the right side of the board powers pixel ports 9 through 16. So you can use 5 volts on one half of the board and have ports 1 through 8 be for 5 volt pixels. Then you could power the other half of the board with 12 volts and have ports 9 through 16 be for 12 volt pixels. Make sure to pay attention to the labels on the power terminals. The grounds are to the outside of the board and the positives are toward the inside of the board. Going back to the SRX1 V4 receiver, next there are these 4 dip switches. All V4 type receivers and older have these switches, and these are the terminator switches. What these do is terminate the signal on the board, and these must be switched up for on if this is the last receiver in a chain. Even if this is the only receiver in a chain, make sure to have them on since it's technically the last. This is to prevent what's called signal reflection, and this could happen on the last receiver on a chain and make your pixels flicker or not work. If this receiver is in the beginning or middle of a chain, leave the switches down for off. Next, at the bottom of the board are the two RJ45 jacks. These look like Ethernet ports and use an Ethernet cable, but they are technically considered RJ45 jacks. This is because these cannot connect to an Ethernet device. You cannot connect them to a router, to a Raspberry Pi, or even a computer. These must be connected to another RJ45 jack on a controller that is made just for receivers. Otherwise, you could damage the board. These jacks are where the receivers get data from a controller to then control the pixels. You only need to use one jack to connect to a controller, and you can use either of them. The other jack is for connecting more receivers and chaining them off of one another. You need to use an Ethernet cable with Cat5 speeds or better, and you can only go up to 250 feet or around 76 meters away from the controller. And then finally, on the bottom left of the board is the ID switch or mode switch. This is used to select which protocol the receiver should expect to receive, and then also which ID the receiver is in the chain. If you look on the back side of the board, there's a chart explaining what all the different modes are used for and where to set the switch to use those modes. You can use a small screwdriver to adjust the switch. Whichever letter or number the arrow points to is the mode you'll be using. I'll explain all the different modes and settings later in the video. So that is everything on the V4 SRX1 receiver. Now, like I said, if you have an SRX2 receiver or an SRX4 receiver, or the power supply ones that aren't the V5 type receiver, all of those will still work exactly like this one's described. Just the RJ45 jacks are in different places, the power terminals are moved, and the little switch is in a different place. So there's nothing really different about it other than the components are moved around. But now I'm going to talk about the V5 receiver. So if you have this receiver or this receiver right here, this is the part you'll want to follow along with. Starting at the top, we have the 4 ports again in order from 1 to 4. These ports also only work with 3-wire pixels, and pixels with a clock wire cannot be used. Again, if you have pixels with a clock wire, you'll have to use an actual controller and connect them there since the receivers don't support it. Each port is fused with a 5 amp fuse. However, the V5 receivers have switched to using E fuses, which are automatically reset when the board is powered down, then back up. You can also reset them from the web interface of a controller if you're using a V5 series controller. There are red indicator lights above each port, and if one is lit, that means that port's fuse has blown and you'll have to reset it. Again, towards the middle of the board, there are 4 data LEDs that will light up if the receiver is properly communicating with a controller. The V5 receivers are also powered by the power terminal on the bottom right of the board. The board accepts any voltage between 5 and 13 DC volts, and the connector is rated for a max of 20 amps. The pixels voltage you plan to use with this receiver should match the input voltage on the terminal like with the other receivers. So if you're powering the board with 12 volts, only use 12 volt pixels. If you're powering the board with 5 volts, only use 5 volt pixels. New on the V5 receivers is this additional terminal here labeled External Fuse Control. This is meant to be used with an F8 power distribution board with E fuses. If you connect 2 wires between this terminal and the fuse control terminal on the power distro board, now you can control the fuses on that distro board with the controller the receiver is connected to. You just have to use a V5 series controller for this to work. Otherwise, the fuses will automatically reset if one blows when you power the board down and power it back up. Below the fuse control terminal is the test button. This button works the same as the test button on the V4 receiver and is used to test pixels that are directly on the receiver. You can press the button once to enter test mode and then continue pressing it to switch through the different test patterns. The data LEDs will once again change depending on which test pattern you're on. To turn off the test mode, hold the test button until the data LEDs flash or the pixels turn off. At the bottom of the board, once again, there are the 2 RJ45 jacks that are used for the receiver to receive data from a controller and also send data to the next receiver in line. The V5 receivers are slightly different than the V4 receivers, and you can now no longer use whichever jack you want. The input signal must come in on the left, and the output signal, if chaining multiple receivers, must go out on the right. You can see the jacks are labeled input and output here. You'll notice the V5 receivers no longer have terminator switches on the board, and that's because the receivers can now terminate the signals themselves. so you don't need to worry about doing that. And then finally, on the bottom left of the board is the mode/ID selector, which works the same as the ones on the other receivers. There's also a chart on the back of the V5 receivers that show which each setting does. The V5 receivers have lots of new features, such as temperature, voltage, and amperage detection, the ability to count how many pixels are on a port, and the ability to upgrade the receiver firmware from a V4 or V5 controller. However, all of the other features I just talked about and fuse resetting from the web only works with V5 controllers. If you have a chain of multiple types of receivers and add a V5 receiver in, the extra features will still work as long as the chain is on a V5 controller. Okay, so now that we know exactly how these receivers work and all of the specifications about them, now I'm going to talk about this little dial switch down here at the bottom and what this does and how you set this up. All V2 and newer receivers have this dial switch somewhere on the board, no matter if you have an SRX2, an SRX4, any power supply receivers, all of them have this switch. This is what you use to tell the controller and receivers which protocol they should expect to receive, and then which receiver they are in a chain. So if we have a chain of like 3 different receivers, all chaining off of one output on a controller, the receivers aren't really that smart, even though they're called smart receivers, and they can't figure out which one they are in the chain, so you have to tell them which one they are in the chain by using the dial. So this one could be receiver A, then B, then C. Or if you're using a different protocol, this one may be 1, this one may be 2, and then the last one may be 3. So that's why the dial switch is there. And like I said, if you look on the back side of the board, if I can get it to focus maybe. Okay, it does not want to focus. I will just show a picture of it. There is a little chart that shows all the different modes and which letters or numbers to set the dial to for those modes. And for all the receivers, the modes are exactly the same, so it's not like certain protocols use different letters on different receivers. This applies for all the receivers. So first is normal mode, and to use normal mode, you would set the dial to 0 and point the arrow at 0. Normal mode basically makes the receiver act as a dumb receiver, and it will be the only one in the chain. You cannot chain any after it, and it works with V3, V4, V5 controllers, Pi and BeagleBone controllers. It is just acting as a dumb, non-chainable receiver. And if you are using that mode, you're going to have to turn on the terminator switches, since that's the last receiver in a chain. Now, like I said, the V5 receivers don't have terminator switches, so you don't have to worry about it. The next mode is the version 1 protocol. This is the protocol you should use if you plan on connecting the receivers to any older controllers, such as a V3 series Falcon controller, or if you have any older Pi or BeagleBone controllers that only work with version 1 protocol, this is the protocol you want to use. If you can't tell which protocol your controller works with, I'd recommend checking a manual first to see if it even supports receivers. If your controller does support receivers, then you can check and see which protocols it supports. So to use version 1 protocol, the dial should be set to anything between 1 and 3. Now you might be wondering, why are there multiple numbers there? Why can it be set to anything between 1 or 3? Well, this is where we start to have to tell them and identify which receiver is which. I'll show some pictures on the screen so this makes sense. So let's say you have this chain of 3 receivers. This one at the top is the first one connected to the controller, then this one is the second one in the chain, and this is the third one in the chain. What you would set the very first receiver to is the number 1, because anything, like I said, between 1 and 3 is for version 1 protocol, and you're going to want to number these in order so the receivers know which one is which. So this first one would be set to 1, this second one would be set to 2, and then the third receiver would be set to 3 on the dial with the terminator switches on, since this is the last receiver. Now that's just for this protocol. When you're using the other protocols I'll talk about, you're not going to be using numbers 1 through 3 to go in order, because those are reserved just for version 1 protocol. Now if you only had 2 receivers on a chain, you would still start off with 1, this one would be set to 1, and then this one would be set to 2 with the terminator switches on for this one. And then if you want to, version 1 protocol does work with the very old V1 receivers, so you can add these in a chain with the newer receivers, but you cannot add these in a chain if you're using them with a newer controller. newer controllers do not work with the version 1 protocol. And then the third mode you can use these in is the version 2 protocol. Version 2 protocol is for any new Pi or BeagleBone controllers or any controllers that support receivers other than Falcon controllers. So version 2 protocol is for all of those new ones, and you would set the dial on the receivers to anything between 4 and 9 to use that protocol. The reason why it's a bigger range now is because version 2 protocol allows up to 6 receivers to be chained off of one output. So for a little example, let's say I have this Culp 128D-B BeagleBone controller, and I'm having a chain of 4 receivers attached to it. Well, I know these need to be set to something between 4 and 9 since I'm using version 2 protocol, and since I need to set them in order, the very first one is going to be set to 4, the second one will be set to 5, the third one would be set to 6, and then the final one would be set to 7, and the final one would have the terminator switches on. Now, if I wanted to, I could add 2 more receivers, and if I did, the next one in line would be 8 and then 9, and you're ordering these from lowest number to highest number, but you just have to make sure to stay in the range your protocol works with. So since version 2 protocol is between 4 and 9, the first receiver would start with 4. And then there is one final mode these receivers work in, and that is for all of the newer Falcon controllers, for Falcon V4 and V5 controllers. Now this mode uses letters A to F. They didn't want to go from 9 to 10, 11, 12 because trying to cram all those numbers on the dial would be hard. So this protocol uses letters A to F. Now if you take a look at the V2 receiver and you look at the chart on the back, it says this protocol only works with V4 controllers, but it also does work with V5 controllers. Just no V5 controllers existed when this was made, so don't worry about that. But if you look on newer receivers like V4 or anything newer than that, it actually shows up as auto detect protocol. Not for V4 or V5 controllers, it just shows up as auto detect protocol. That is because on V4 and V5 receivers, if you use anything between A and F, it can automatically detect which protocol you're trying to use. So you'd still have to set the ID to something between A and F, but it can detect which protocol you're using. The only one it doesn't work with is the version 1 protocol. That must be used with numbers 1 to 3. But if you want to use the version 2 protocol, you can use the letters A to F instead of using 4 to 9 for it. Now I will be honest, I don't know much about the auto detect protocol because there isn't much information out there about it. I have heard from a few people that sometimes it doesn't work and they have to force to use the 4 to 9 protocol for Pi and BeagleBone controllers. But for V4 and V5 controllers, you're going to want to use letters A to F. So now, just for it to make sense, I'm going to show another example again. Let's say I have these 4 receivers chained to my F16 V5. Now, since I am using the protocol for the V4 and V5 controllers, I'm going to be using letters A to F. So if you had a guess, what do you think the first receiver should be set to? It should be set to the letter A because that's the first one in line. Then the second receiver should be set to the letter B, the third one should be set to C, and then the final receiver in the chain should be set to D. And we also can't forget to turn on those terminator switches. And then if I were to chain 2 more receivers, I would set those to E and then F, and then I can't chain anymore because I've reached 6, I've reached the limit. So if you want to use any of these receivers on a V4 or V5 controller, you're going to be setting the mode switch to anything between A and F, and then depending on the order of them is which letter in between A and F it's going to be set to. Now we're so close to being done with this part. I know the video is probably already like 40 minutes long, but there are a few additional things I need to talk about with the mode selection switches and the other receivers. First, on the NRX1 differential receiver, this is automatically a dumb receiver since you can't chain it. So there are no mode switches, there are no terminator switches. You don't need to do any of that. Just hook it up, but it can be the only one receiver in a chain. Then also on the SRX2 receivers and SRX4 receivers, which I'll get to in a second, on the SRX2 receivers, you need to remember that these count as 2 receivers. So if you're using these on a Falcon V4 or V5, let's say, you're going to be using letters A to F to order them like normal. Well, let's say first you have an SRX1 receiver. Since this is the first one in the chain, you're going to set this to A. Then you have an SRX2 receiver. This is the second one in the chain, so you're going to set this to B. Okay, makes sense so far. But then you have this SRX1 receiver you want to add to the very end of this chain. Now you may be thinking, since this is the third receiver in the chain, you're going to set this one to C. Well, that is actually not true, because since the SRX2 counts as two differential receivers, that means B and C are already being used by it. 4 of the ports are acting as differential receiver B, and then the other 4 are acting as receiver C. So this SRX1 receiver is technically the 4th receiver in the chain, meaning you would set this to D. Now this is also the same for SRX4 receivers, so let's use that same example again. So you have the first receiver in line, it's an SRX1, that's going to be set to A, okay? And then you have this SRX4 receiver. This one is going to be set to B, since it's the second one in the chain, okay? Now you want to add one more SRX1 receiver at the end. Which letter is this going to be set to? Well, since the SRX4 receiver counts as 4 receivers on one board, all letters between B and E are already being used, because you have receiver A here first, then the first 4 ports on the SRX4 receiver are B, then the next 4 are C, the third set of ports are D, and then the final set of ports are E, meaning that this final receiver in the chain is going to be set to F, since the SRX4 receiver is already using letters B to E on that receiver. And now you cannot add any more receivers to this chain, since we've already hit all 6 receivers. So that is just something very important you need to keep in mind, that the SRX2 and SRX4 receivers count as 4 and 2 receivers. And you do also need to set the terminator switches on them if it is going to be the last receiver in a chain. But that is all the information for the first part about how to use all these differential receivers. I know there's a lot to it, and we're not done yet because I still have the second part to make. I just didn't want to cram it all into one video and have this be really long. But so far, if you have any questions throughout the first part, please feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. I'll try to answer as soon as I can and help with whatever problem you have. It can be a little difficult to wrap your head around all this information, but it does make it a lot easier to have pixels in different locations in your display. But stay tuned for the next episode, where I'll be talking about pixel port sharing. If you've never heard of that before, you're in for a fun ride. And then also how to set the receivers up on X-Lights and then on your controller's web interface. But other than that, I think that's going to conclude it for this part. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.